Hello and welcome, everyone. It is my absolute honor and pleasure to host this incredible panel, No Weapons, Wars, or Walls. My name is Caree Peterson-Smith. I am the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. And I live in Boston on Massachusetts and Wampanoag land, and IPS, the Institute for Policy Studies, is located in the place called Washington, D.C. on Piscataway land. And I want to say right up top that I know I speak for IPS and the other organizations that are sponsors of this call, that we stand in solidarity with the ongoing struggles for self-determination of Indigenous peoples here in the Americas and actually across the world. And I hope that our conversation tonight is one contribution in the vein of solidarity with those struggles and efforts everywhere at demilitarization and decolonization. What an honor, again, to host this panel. And that panel involves these amazing participants, Lindsay Kashgarian of National Priorities Project, Rosa Barrientos of the Southern Borders Communities Coalition, and Ngakia Kamara of Dissenters. I'm going to say a little more about each of those folks in a bit. First, let me just say that the sponsoring organizations of this call are the Institute for Policy Studies, the National Priorities Project, which is a project of IPS, and then the Southern Border Communities Coalition and Defund Hate Coalition, as well as Dissenters. So thank you to those sponsors. Thank you to everybody at IPS who made this happen. And let me just say a word about why we're here tonight, and we offer some thoughts to kind of frame our conversation before I introduce in a more thorough way the guests, or rather the panelists who will be having this conversation, and invite you all who are watching to participate with us. So we are in the midst of a big conversation about spending. Tonight we're going to be talking about military spending and militarized spending, but there is, of course, another conversation that is happening, a national conversation that's happening in the US right now about federal spending. That is a conversation about infrastructure legislation that has involved months of wrangling and hand-wringing about essentially how little the US government can spend in investing in basic public necessities for this country. Meanwhile, there is virtually no controversy about another piece of legislation which is moving through Congress at the same exact time, which is the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. While some progressive lawmakers have called attention to the fact that this legislation funds even more than the Pentagon actually requested, that is, the White House and Pentagon talked about what they want in the military budget, and Congress said, no, we will give you billions more. So there has been some attention to that, but from some progressive lawmakers. Similarly, there has been some attention to and efforts to block the 1033 program, a program that takes weapons from the Pentagon and funds them to local law enforcement in our communities. There has been an effort by progressive lawmakers to block an additional $1 billion in US military aid to Israel on top of the $3.8 billion that they received already. There has been some kind of pushback, but for the most part, that is a conversation in Congress, one that is not really happening in a very public way. There's been very little public conversation actually about this thing that's happening. And the supposed arguments for why that we hear about the infrastructure legislation, for why we can't spend $3 trillion on infrastructure, the notion that this is going to increase the national debt or that this is going to increase inflation. None of those are brought to bear when it comes to spending on militarization. They simply are not, they don't come up. So there is, for those who say, well, where will we get the money to spend on infrastructure? There's a simple answer that many of us have, which is cut the military budget. There are hundreds of billions of dollars there that could, of course, go to funding the needs that the public has. Which include all kinds of healthcare, broadband internet to areas of the country woefully lacking in it, and of course, a transition to a decarbonized economy and resiliency efforts in the face of climate change. We could cut the military budget to pay for that and much, much more. But as important as that point is, I think that actually what the National Priorities Project, who kind of initiated this call tonight, and what I think other folks in the call, all of our panelists are saying, is actually there's more to it than that. It's not just about taking money out of the military pot and putting it into the public needs pot. We should actually drill a little deeper. At IPS, we work very closely with the Poor People's Campaign, and our friend, Reverend William Barber, who's co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, says often that a budget is a moral document. It's one thing for government officials to talk about things like freedom and democracy and human rights rhetorically, but what they actually allocate in terms of budgeting shows where they actually stand and what they actually prioritize. It reveals those priorities. And so this isn't just about moving the money, it's about a critical reflection on what are the kind of the things that the government spends money on, and what are the things that that are actually needed and that are not funded. And that conversation needs to be grounded in a sense of what is right for this country to direct resources to. To that end, Lindsay Kashgarian, who's one of the panelists tonight, has written about how the money that the US invests in devastating people around the world could be used to help Afghans who are seeking refuge to this country and elsewhere. That could be a way to redirect money. Other co-workers of mine at National Priorities Project, like Ashik Sadiq and Laura Steichen, along with Basav Sen, our climate justice policy director, have written about how the US should take this money and contribute to different efforts to mitigate climate change all around the world, not just in this country, but all around the world, since the US has, of course, led the way in producing fossil fuel emissions and in undermining efforts at a more sustainable economy. The point here is that when we're talking about what the US invests money in, I think we shouldn't just talk about it nationally, but actually in a global sense. And I think that's what we're here to do tonight. There's one other point that I want to make, that this report that the National Priorities Project released, which we're going to talk about momentarily, a point that this report makes, which is really about that this isn't just a military budget, but a militarized budget, actually, that the US has each year. And this is an expansive view that considers not only what the US invests in terms of the formal military, but in militarization writ large through federal policing, including policing of migration at the borders and elsewhere. I can't overstate the significance of this contribution, and I want to explain why by way of what was illustrated for us last year in the midst of the Black-led uprisings in response to the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the countless other abuses by police and by white supremacist vigilantes that people rose up against last year. So during those protests in Washington in particular, when Trump wanted to mobilize the military to repress resistance, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, various retired generals publicly said, no, we do not want to deploy troops, because whatever anger people have toward the police right now, who are repressing people in cities across the country, we do not want that to spill over into anger at the military. We do not want people to connect the dots between the police repression on the streets in the US and what the military does all around the world. They wanted to keep those things separated. And similarly, I think about Portland, Oregon, which of course became a major center of resistance and repression last year during those uprisings. And we saw, personnel in military uniform that included people in the Border Patrol, people in Customs and Border Protection, and ICE, who were there not only repressing protests, but disappearing people into unmarked cars and so on, something that happens in immigrant communities literally every day. And so the point here is that the government actually makes the connections between those things in who they deploy to the protests, in the kind of everyday practices of those different agencies, and how they budget it, how they actually fund these things. And I think that we are called to make those connections too. And I think this is an incredible panel to do that. And so with that, I want to finally introduce our panel and get into this conversation tonight. And I'll kind of go through our different panelists, and then I'll ask them some questions. So first, there's Lindsay Kashgarian, who is the program director of the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, a project that produces research and analysis on the federal budget and military spending, and that produced this report last month that we'll be discussing. There is Rosa Barrientos, who is the Border Policy Advocacy Coordinator for the Southern Border Communities Coalition, a national coalition convened by Alliance San Diego. Rosa's family immigrated from Guanajuato, Mexico, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, okay? And she grew up in East Los Angeles, California, right, East Los. At the age of 18, she was granted Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, and has since become an advocate for a permanent immigration solution for all of America's 11 million undocumented immigrants. Prior to joining Alliance San Diego, she worked at the Coalition for Humane Immigration Rights, where she held various roles, from leading the organization's campaign to protect DACA, organizing undocumented youth in Northern California to successfully fighting to secure more education resources. Rosa holds an AA in Chicano Studies and Social Behavioral Analysis from East Los Angeles College, and a BA in Ethnic Studies and Political Science from Sacramento State University. And lastly, we have Ngakia Kamara from Dissenters. She's an organizer with Dissenters at American University. Dissenters is a new national organization that is leading our generation to reclaim resources from the war industry, reinvest in life-giving institutions, and repair collaborative relationships with the earth and people around the world. So welcome to you all. Thank you all for joining us. I have a few questions for our panelists, and then we are going to have a Q&A. So I already see some questions in the Q&A. Folks who may not be familiar with Zoom, there's a little Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And so while our brilliant panelists are talking and you think of questions, you can go ahead and drop those in the Q&A, and we can get to those later in our session. So with that, Lindsay, let's talk about this amazing report that NPP put out last month, which notes that the United States has spent $21 trillion on militarization since the 9/11 attacks and the beginning of the war on terror, which really puts that 3.7 trillion that was originally proposed for infrastructure in perspective, right? And I wonder if you could just talk us through this. What's included in this calculation? And then what are the impacts of this spending?
Thanks, Corey. I really appreciate your introduction to this, and I'm so glad to be here. And I just want to also appreciate my colleagues, Ashik Siddiq and Laura Steichen, who wrote this report with me and who are here supporting and watching us all tonight. And hopefully they'll have a chance to speak to some of the questions too, if they want to do so. I can speak for them, or they can speak through me. So I appreciate all of that. So I just want to underscore something you already said, which is that budgets are moral documents. And we fully believe that. And what our budget pays for, basically you get what you pay for. And that's what we get with our federal budget. And so when we talk about dollars, it's not just that this many dollars kind of disappeared into somewhere. It's really that, those dollars did something. And so we have to focus both on the amount of money, but also on what they did. So the more we fund war, the more we fund punitive immigration enforcement, the more we fund racist, aggressive law enforcement, the more we fund militarization of police, the more we're going to see of those things. And that is exactly what's happened over the last 20 years. And if we fund them less, we can limit their damage, right? Less funding, they won't be able to do as much, and there will be less damage done. The other reason to focus on the dollars is on the harm done by the money that's not being spent, right? And that's where you mentioned the $3.7 trillion Build Back Better package that is now being walked back to 1.7 or wherever it's going to end up. Right now, we're hearing that the country can't afford basic things. We're hearing we can't afford paid leave. We can't afford to expand Medicare. We can't afford dental insurance for older people. We can't afford hearing and vision insurance for older people. We're hearing we can't afford to adequately address climate change, and that we can't afford, all of these different things. But the reason that we can't afford those things isn't because we don't have the resources. It's not actually a problem of being able to afford a certain dollar amount, right? It's not that we don't have $3.7 trillion. We really do have $3.7 trillion. It's what we're spending it on and where it's going. And the problem is that, it's not, we don't just want those things. There is harm being done to people because we don't have those things, right? There are families that aren't able to get by because they don't have adequate support for childcare. There are older people who are suffering without, adequate dental insurance, and on. There are all these things. 1 in 3 Americans this year experienced an extreme weather event. So there are all of these things that are causing real suffering in the world that we're not addressing because this money is where it is. So the second reason is to reallocate those dollars to alleviate suffering in other places, not just we'll stop causing suffering and we'll be able to alleviate suffering that's ongoing. This is also really powerful because it can help link movements, right? Once we see these connections, we can link together, we can work together more, and we become more powerful. And so we'll get more of all of the things that we're looking for. And that's one of the reasons that I think we're all here tonight. That's why I'm so excited about all of us being here together tonight. So why the budget? So it had been 20 years after 9/11, and we released this study to see what the US response had cost. And as you mentioned, we found that the cost over 20 years had been $21 trillion and counting on both the military and militarization. We broke that down into 3 major categories. There's 16 trillion, which is the biggest chunk for the war and military. That's the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's the 800 military bases that we have all over the world. It's the troops that we keep at those military bases. It's the weapons we deploy to those places, all of those things. The second piece of it is nearly $1 trillion for what we call homeland security, right? And that's almost half of that went to ICE and customs and border protection. So it's a huge amount of money. And all of that started, those ICE and CBP as they exist now did not exist prior to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security as a response to 9/11. And the third segment is more than 700 billion, which, speaking in trillions, we'll try to stick with trillions for a moment, is nearly $750 billion for federal law enforcement that disproportionately affects Black and Brown people, right? And I'll talk more about the links between that federal law enforcement and immigration enforcement, because there are major links there. So it's not just the parts of DHS that we might typically think of, the ICE budget and the Border Patrol and those things. And also a part of that is the fact that more than half of the money for the military went to contractors. $7 trillion, that is more than 2 Build Back Better packages over the last 20 years have gone to military contractors. So there's also a profit motive that underlies a lot of this, right? And that's a theme through a lot of it too. Now, when we found that we spent $21 trillion on militarization and war, we also looked at what else you could do with that money. And we found that you could do all of the following. I want to say all of the above, but they're not above. So you could fully decarbonize our electric grid. You could forgive all student debt. You could create 5 million $15 an hour jobs for 10 years. You could extend the child tax credit for 10 years, which is one of the major Build Back Better components. And you could fund preschool for 10 years. You could do all of that for 10 years for less than $21 trillion and still have a bunch of money left over. So it's a huge amount that we're both, we're spending all of this money, we're harming people, and it's a huge amount that we're losing by what we're not spending it on. And when it comes to what we did do with that money, all of these activities basically existed before 9/11, right? But 9/11 and our response to 9/11 severely aggravated them. We have to recognize the actual harm that is behind these dollars. Some of what that means is 900,000 people dead in US wars. It means 39 million people displaced in those wars. It means here at home, almost 6 million people have been deported over the last 20 years. It means under the apparatus of ICE and Border Patrol that were born in the response to 9/11, right? And that was a major acceleration from the number of deportations that had taken place prior to that. So all of these things got much worse as part of the US response to 9/11. And the violence isn't actually limited to government agencies that bear weapons, right? It's not just the guys who put on the tactical gear and show up. It's also our federal prosecution system. 1/3 of federal sentences were for immigration offenses at the end of this time period. Half of federal arrests were for immigration offenses. Only 2% of arrests were for violent offenses. So we're supposed to believe that our federal law enforcement is here to, like, I don't know what, stop gangs, stop drug dealer, whatever, like, but that's not what they're doing. They're stopping immigration offenses. They're stopping immigrants. And that's what a lot of this money is going to. So that's why we include all of these different pieces. Now, the other thing is that too often we think about the foreign and domestic in separate spheres, right? And they're not really that separate. The policies aren't separate. The borders aren't even that, they're made up. They're more linked than we often acknowledge. So people can cross borders, but policies cross borders too. The US has always had domestic policies that tied to its foreign policies. Think of Japanese internment in World War II or McCarthyism in the Cold War. Our domestic policies so often reflect what is going on in our foreign policy in ways that I think we don't necessarily always think about. Now, the war on terror and the fears of terrorism that came along with it, they brought us the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. They brought us an entire reshaping of US foreign policy around counterterrorism, but they also brought us the creation of ICE and Border Patrol. They brought us a refocusing of the Department of Justice, which we don't necessarily always think of in these terms, but they completely refocused around a counterterrorism focus, and in the process began targeting communities based on race. First, it was Muslim communities, but over time that increasingly morphed to include immigrant communities and hit Black African-American communities and hit hit Chinese communities and all kinds of other ethnicities that have been targeted by the FBI and other arms of federal law enforcement. Now, over that 20-year period, spending on ICE and border and customs and border protection also doubled, and so did deportations. So we got exactly what we paid for. We spent more money and we deported more people. It was like a very clear connection between those things. Now, I also want to tell a little bit about, so we don't always think of agencies like the FBI, the DEA, alcohol, tobacco and firearms, ATF, US Marshal Service. We don't hear about these all the time in these areas, but all of them have formal collaborations with ICE and Border Patrol, direct connections and are helping to support the mission of ICE and Border Patrol. And just to sort of underscore the lack of kind of real lines where the borders are, the US DEA that here is responsible for many arrests and prosecutions in the drug enforcement space, also has 91 overseas offices. So they're operating in both places. And we think of the US military operating overseas all the time, but we don't necessarily realize that the FBI, the DEA, the US Marshals, all of these agencies also have operations overseas. And so there are lots of direct connections. And now is a really important time to make these connections for a few reasons. The US has left Afghanistan, which gives us an opportunity to question the full range of spending and activities in the war on terror and everything that our military is doing overseas. 4 years of Trump called attention to immigrant deportations and detentions in a way that we've never seen before, and in a way that we can still capitalize on to create political pressure that hadn't previously existed before that. The growing strength and awareness of white supremacy and the recognition of the militarization of law enforcement and the rise of the movement for Black Lives and other other organizing that happened last summer. All of these things are still kind of fresh, right? And they may not be at the forefront of the media right now, but they're still there, and they represent a lot of movement strength that has grown over these years. And so right now they're all kind of existing in their own separate spaces, but that's why we're here tonight, to bring them together.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Lindsay. And wow, you really you brought so much together. I mean, really putting the past 20 years in perspective, acknowledging that Department of Homeland Security didn't exist 20 years ago, and all of these different forms of violence and their connections. Really helpful. Before I come to Ngakia, I just want to hear all about what organizing looks like and what Dissenters is doing to make these connections too. I want to say that there was a question in the Q&A about kind of resources to kind of illustrate what Lindsay was talking about. And I wanted to shout out, again, it's already in the chat, but nationalpriorities.org, NPP's website, has all kinds of great resources to break a lot of this stuff down too. And with that, Ngakia, so good to see you. And there's amazing organizing that Dissenters is doing everywhere, but particularly at American University. And I know that you all really embrace this framework of seeing the connections between militarism, you know, that the US does around the world and here in our communities. And I just wonder if you could talk about, like, with that framework in mind, what does your organizing look like?
Yeah, so thank you, first of all, for inviting me on this panel. It's been amazing to hear so far what y'all have had to say. I'm excited to see where this goes and to learn, because I'm still learning in this organizing process. But yeah, I joined Dissenters 2 years ago because I was a little bit like disillusioned by the way student organizers were operating on my campus. We're like, American University is considered the most politically active campus. Without the political activism, I don't know, that just seems to be lacking. So we have a whole bunch of students that care about so many different things, but never really come together. And I really think Dissenters ties everything together in a way that is so unique and so true to what this country is. Again, we're an anti-militarist organization that is striving to empower youth and teach youth about militarism and how that is connected in our everyday lives. Because I think that a lot of the times we think of the military and militarism as being something that is separate from us or something that is far away. And although we should be caring about what's going on abroad, right? Like, we need to also recognize how it's operating in our backyard and how it's impacting us. I mean, we're under 25 and have experienced all kinds of atrocities and crises. I'm 21, and since 2001 to now, like, I mean, that's just been my life. Every 5 years, every 2 years, there's something that's going on, and it's impacting me and it's impacting my future. And so Dissenters really strives to show how militarism really lies at the crux of a lot of the crises that we have been seeing, and puts things into perspective for young people. What really got my attention about Dissenters, especially, and I know we've been talking about this, was this idea that war and militarism really lie at the center of what this country is. So this country is one that is founded on war and war making. The military is meant to be a destructive force, but the military, again, like, we talk about the formal military and then the ways that militarism arises in different institutions. It arises in different ways across different institutions because militarism lies at the center, at the heart of what this country is. Without militarism and war making, this country would not exist, because the military was meant to disappear people and exploit resources in order to expand colonially and now beyond. And so when we look at police are just, again, like, armed militia. They are local military that are impacting youth and lives and are meant to disappear populations at home, while the formal military is meant to disappear populations abroad and to continue this process of exploiting resources. And these are things that I learned in school, but never really had an organization to connect it to. And dissenters, again, like really just put the bow around everything for me. And uh, even though this is something that is so broad and like sometimes it's so hard for me to like grasp or try to come to terms with where to begin, like and like damn, you know, this exists in literally every single institution, even though it's not the formal military. Again, like it's impacting me, and I'm able to tie my past experiences and present experiences to this destructive institution. I'm like, damn, what do I do about it? You know? And so really what I love about dissenters is that it like we're focusing on what we can do at our universities. Because again, talking about how militarism arises in different institutions, education is one of them. You know, education, our schools have this fealty, this like loyalty to um, militarism and the military, the formal military and police and war making institutions like weapons manufacturing companies. Right now, one of the members on our board of trustees, and the board of trustees is the most important administrative position for anyone to be on, because they handle where our money goes, how that money is used, what programs are like focused on, what programs are implemented and developed. And on our board of trustees sits the former CEO of Northrop Grumman, which is a weapons manufacturing company. He literally left Northrop Grumman and came to AU like right after, which is mortifying. And then, you know, other schools too, like Northwestern, right now have two board of trustee members who were the former CEOs, one from General Dynamics and the other from Boeing, I believe. And so you kind of understand how how schools have this like reciprocal relationship to the military, right? So these people come in and they bring esteem, or you know, so-called esteem, and or recognition and money. And so in return, students are being exploited, our money is being exploited, our experiences, and our lives, because again, these are people who are still invested in war making, and so are going to okay the ROTC to be present on campus, and they're going to okay Lockheed Martin recruiting students on campus. And you like, again, you understand how this is cyclical, how it's reciprocal. um, and rather than, we're talking on a larger scale of government redistribution of money and funding and resources to people at a university level. It's like, how do we have such high tuition, and we're not seeing that, you know, we're not seeing that money and those resources going to students who absolutely need it. Like we need housing. Places like Howard right now, like with Blackburn, the protests at Blackburn, you know, there is there is money to rebuild um, that, like those buildings and those places, but it's going to different places that again are exploiting these resources. And so yeah, so that's what Dissenters is doing. We're really fighting to make sure that our schools are focusing on us and focusing on redistributing and redirecting those resources towards us, so that we can live lives of dignity and so that our futures are secure, both at university and beyond. And again, like university is just one institution where we see that happening, but it needs to start somewhere. And with the youth, hopefully we'll be able to like increase the stigma against military and militarism and policing, and really like turn the tide against all of these evil institutions. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Ngakia, for really just illustrating the ways that militarism shows up, both in terms of denying the resources that students deserve, and in terms of enlisting in more ways than one, young people into the kind of military machine. Thank you so much. Let's turn to Rosa. And speaking of, ways militarism shows up, would love to hear how it shows up in the borderlands. First of all, though, could you please tell me the correct pronunciation of your hometown in Mexico, since I mispronounced it for sure?
You almost got it. Thank you, though. Guanajuato. It's that middle part.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you. Learning a lot of things on this call, and that's one of them. So thank you for that. Okay, but yeah, please. We know that man, the borderlands has been like a key site of state violence and white supremacy, for a very long time, but particularly in recent years. And I wonder if you could talk us through a bit how militarism shows up in those communities.
Yes, and thank you so much for the invitation to really talk about, what's going on in the border and how this impacts us. So I'll start us off with saying that for decades, border militarization has turned the southern border into a mock war zone, complete with border agents masquerading as soldiers, taunting assault rifles, and donning tactical gear. The violent and deadly border wall and the policies that allow this to happen has ravaged our communities for decades. And this isn't just at the borderline, but militarization also is spread into the interior up to 100 miles. And according to the American Immigration Council, since 1993, when the current strategy of concentrated border enforcement was first rolled out along the US-Mexican border, the annual budget for the US Border Patrol has increased more than tenfold, from $363 million to nearly $4.6 billion. Over-policing at the border and our border communities, the use of Pentagon and state resources have led to the expansion of the border militarization footprint. And what I mean by this is that, we're seeing National Guard at the border. States like Texas have both federal and state law enforcement. CBP uses interior checkpoints, revolving patrols located far from the border to apprehend individuals, right? And we're seeing this both at the northern and southern border region. And this has led to incidents of individuals speaking in Spanish in Montana who were profiled by Border Patrol. And this is just, one of the cases that we're seeing with the increase of over-policing at the border. And I'm going to go a little bit more in depth in different buckets. So the first bucket I'll start off is with Customs Border Protection. And the American Immigration Council has estimated that since 2003, the budget of CBP, which includes both the Border Patrol and operations at ports of entry, has nearly tripled, rising from 5.9 billion in FY 2003 to a high of 17.7 billion in fiscal year 2021. And so what this means, the impact is that in 1993, there was 4,139 agents. And in fiscal year 2018, Congress authorized for a hiring of 23,645 agents. And due to hiring issues, Border Patrol was only able to hire 19,648 agents in fiscal year 2019. So out of all of those agents, the US-Mexican border, or 16,739 agents were deployed to the US-Mexican border, and an additional 2,073 agents were deployed to the US-Canada border. And so this leads, this increase of agents has increased a lack of oversight and accountability. The lack of oversight and accountability has led to rampant abuse of cultural violence and almost universal impunity. And I encourage everybody to check out SBCC website, and I'll drop the link in a few minutes, where we're calling for a congressional oversight of unlawful Border Patrol cover-up teams created to protect agents, not the public, from liability in cases of excessive use of force. And right, this often leads, or this has led to agents viewing migrants as not fully human, but they see them as enemies. And at SBCC, we have documented over 150 deaths, including children, at the hands of SBCC since 2010. CBP, sorry, at the hands of CBP since 2010. The next part I want to talk about is the smart wall. And I'm sure many of you have heard this new terminology, right? And what this has led to an increase of invasive surveillance and technology deployed to border communities that infringes on quality of life and privacy. So a lot of our communities have to go through, a lot of our community members have to go through several checkpoints for school, work, visits, doctors, everything. Imagine having to worry about your legal status. Think about, do I put my legal status on the line, or do I go visit the doctor? These are the daily questions that our community members have to ask themselves. And most importantly, oftentimes technology faces the home of border residents without their knowledge. And similarly to a physical wall, the smart technology or the smart wall can lead to environmental and wildlife impacts. It also leads to an increase of migrant deaths. So in order to avoid being detected, migrants walk through even more dangerous and remote terrain. And most importantly, and I think Lindsay talked about this part, is that the border is oftentimes testing ground for technology that is deployed across the cities in the interior. And we saw, right, last year, CBP drones were deployed on Black Lives Matter protesters across the nation. But right, this, and also going more in depth of border surveillance has turned into a for-profit industry. So sharing that in a research done by Just Fellows, they estimated that CBP has a total of $743 million from Congress for tech and surveillance. In fiscal year 2021, the Department of Homeland Security received $780 million from Congress to do the same. And CBP alone is the largest government contractor in border and migration control services, with over 46,000 contracts, which equals to $26 billion. And this was based on a 2019 report. But right, this whole notion of for-profit industry has led to an annual border security expo that brings together border security corporations, industry executives, and top officials from DHS, CBP, and ICE. These are the same companies that are making campaign contributions. So if you're wondering, why is it that we're deploying so much technology at the border? It's for this reason, that they're the same industries that are contributing to campaigns. And just the last segment that I want to talk about is wall construction. So from 2019 to 2020, a total of $9.9 billion were unlawfully transferred funds to finance border wall construction, with funds Congress had appropriated from the Pentagon. And similar, right, the creation of the wall has led to a rising increase of migrant deaths. So in the last 2 years, at least 15 people have died after falling from a border wall. And that's just within the last 2 years. This has tripled. If you go into our SBCC website, we're also tracking deaths that have come from a fall. And over the last years, this number has tripled. So 15 people in 2 years. And although there was a call to halt construction for the wall, we are still seeing and continue to monitor ongoing construction at the border, even though the Biden administration, as I mentioned, announced that they would halt construction. and made a campaign commitment to not build another foot of wall. And so we're seeing this in the Rio Grande Valley. And I'll wrap up saying that walls, internal checkpoints, and general prevention through deterrence strategy has contributed to thousands of migrant deaths as individuals are pushed into more remote, dangerous crossings or routes to avoid detection. And in the same way, failing to provide adequate resources to promptly receive and process asylum seekers at points of entries is another incarnation of this militarization.
Wow, beautiful. You know, each of you have put so much richness on the table. And, you know, Rosa, I'm just thinking about you know, even you're talking about the borderlands and how this also goes beyond the borderlands. You know, even when you're talking about the kind of surveillance drones that are CBP drones that then get deployed, you know, to do surveillance on Black Lives Matter protests. You know, so many of the surveillance drones, of course, are piloted in U.S. war on terror operations in Yemen, right, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, abroad, and then brought to the border and then brought to our cities. So that the connections really abound. And you know, what each of you has done is kind of describe this really expansive notion of militarism, right? That like includes these wars abroad and includes this incredible, I mean, the level, just the number of personnel you were describing, Grosa, that are hired at the border is kind of unreal. And then, you know, at the universities, the ways that universities end up, you know, students end up doing research and or, you know, being recruited to these agencies. So there's a kind of big monster here that you're all describing parts of, and it's incredibly helpful. You know, each of you also, part of your work is taking action to stop this, to disrupt these things, right? To actually, you know, take down this monster. And one of the questions in the Q&A asks about that, like, how do you actually convince the public? I mean, the question is, there's a specific question about, look, just in terms of efficiency, you know, if you invest more in things like green jobs or whatever, it's just more, it's actually, you know, the same money that is used for militarism is more effective with our social needs. So we can speak to that, but I wonder also just if for each of you, or, you know, whoever is up for answering about the public conversation, how do we actually, what are some ways that you like to engage, you know, with folks about these different things, whether they're in your community or at large? So I see wheels turning for each of you. But Ngakia, it looks like you got something to say, and then can call on Lindsay after.
Yeah, just basically making the connection, educating people. I think a big part of organizing is really just making an open space and allowing for people, you know, who may not know, to come in. And so like having teach-ins or, you know, having like a webinar, like, you know, that students can come in on, and like, you know, then having one-on-ones or just talking with people individually and really just making that connection, because again, people don't really understand the insidious ways that militarism is like exists within their lives and impacts the decisions that they make, or impacts their lives, period. So really opening people's eyes to that, and again, like just focusing on their specific experience and like getting to know them and just talking things through that way is really helpful to frame it, so that they can understand. And then, you know, with that, hopefully they'll be more willing and impassioned about the work to join.
Connecting with people, these are the words of a good organizer. Lindsay, you were going to speak to this too.
Yeah, I'm going to say, I think we can actually recognize that a lot of people are kind of already with us. I'm going to mention some poll results that Curry yourself brought my attention to recently, which show that an overwhelming majority, especially of younger people in this country, kind of get these things. And I think it's probably true. I think Ngakia is absolutely right that they don't necessarily know the ins and outs, and there's a lot of education to be done for sure. But they've heard enough that they're suspicious of US militarism domestically and in the world. And it's really encouraging, actually. And I think so I think what we need to do is we definitely need to do the education part, and then we also need to give people outlets. And it's so great that, you know, places like dissenters exist as an outlet for people to feel empowered to do something about it. It's one thing to get all worked up about how mad you are that the US has done something or other, but it's another thing to actually know how to then take that to Congress, or how to make that how to make the difference, or take it to your school administration or wherever it is that you're taking it. So I think the big piece is that we should recognize who's with us, and make sure that we're giving them adequate ways to speak out and be effective. And that's what groups like dissenters are so great at.
I'm so glad you brought up that poll data, Lindsay, because it kind of blew my mind, honestly. Like when you think about how it's been, I mean, you know, as Ngakia said, like it's pretty at the center of American society, unfortunately, particularly the past 20 years. It's just been like steady pro-war, you know, stuff in the media and from officials with very little dissent. And the fact that despite all that, you know, clear majorities of Americans, and particularly young people, oppose this kind of militarism, it's really quite inspiring, actually, about the population of this country and what's possible. I wonder, you know, just Lindsay, there's actually a question in the Q&A that's a good follow-up, which is about the question of data and using data. And this gets at, you know, people can have, you know, again, in the face of all of this kind of pro-war stuff that we see in the media and elsewhere, people can have an inclination, there's something not right here. I'm seeing something different. And yet there's a question of in a concrete way, breaking it down. And you know, NPP works with a lot of data. And so I wonder if you could say a word about like what it means to access data, and then how do you make that accessible?
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of two major types of data in this sphere. One is the thing that NPP really does, which is we look at the budgets and we look at the numbers. And, you know, I'm absolutely sure that the majority of people don't know that we have 800 military bases. They don't know that we've spent $21 trillion on this over the last 20 years, and how much bigger that is than this, you know, legislative package that's getting hammered right now. So those kind of data, if, you know, they're fairly accessible. They come from the US government. It's tough, though, to kind of break through with just numbers to get people's attention and get them to understand something. Then I think the other kind of data is, we were just talking about a poll. There's polling data, and where are people now, and what are they thinking, and how do they understand these things, and helping to understand that. But I'll say about both kinds, they're both incredibly helpful and useful. And there is also absolutely no substitute for kind of getting down and dirty and talking to people and understanding where they're coming from on both of those fronts. So, you know, you have to understand the human impact of where the $21 trillion went, and you have to understand, you know, why are younger people, or, you know, what are younger people experiencing that makes them more suspicious of this about the world. And I think we all have ideas about what that is, and it may not be terribly mysterious, but you still hear surprising things when you actually talk to people and hear what sticks for them, or what's the most meaningful. So I would just say never data without context.
Never data without context. That is very, very helpful for researchers and organizers. Friends, we are nearing the end of our hour together, and in a minute, I'm going to give our speakers a chance to offer some closing thoughts. One thing just to say, you know, there's some questions in the Q&A that are like, how can I follow this work? How can I stay plugged in? So, you know, maybe in closing thoughts, you all can kind of shout out your org some more, but please, you know, I think all of us all these organizations represented are on social media, and there's a bunch of the information about this event in particular, and including the sponsoring organizations, at the IPS events website. So that's ips-dc.org/events, which will have this thing, so you can check that out and follow up. And yeah, let's go to closing thoughts. And I want to give Rosa a chance to close us out first.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to close off with sharing, right, that as border communities, and even just in general, right, the people closest to the problem have the solution. And for us for our border communities and at SPCC, we developed a new border vision, which I encourage all of you to read. We want to make sure that the border, we expand public safety, we protect human life, and welcome people at the border. Border communities have been impacted the last decades by militarization, and oftentimes their experiences are left out of how this has impacted them. So I encourage all of you to, again, check out our SPCC website. We have a newsletter called Borderlands, goes out bi-weekly, where you get to hear the latest things that are going on at the border and hear a little bit more about the work that we're doing on the ground. And thank you for the invitation. It's been truly insightful.
Thank you. It's been so great having you as part of this. Ngaki, I want to go to you next.
Yeah, so again, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. I'm so glad to be representing dissenters. Just wanted to, again, shout out dissenters, follow We Are Dissenters on Instagram, Twitter. You can also follow AU Dissenters on Instagram and Twitter. I'm also going to put this petition in the chat for y'all. It's against, right now, AU Dissenters is organizing against Wes Bush, who is the former CEO of Northrop Grumman, who's on our board of trustees. We're trying to get him out as quickly as possible. And so, yeah, if y'all could sign that as concerned community members and support dissenters Divest from Death campaigns across universities. And if y'all are interested in Divest from Death, y'all can reach out to dissenters or me through the Instagram and Twitter as well.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ngakia. And Lindsay, I'll give you the last word.
Wow, lucky. No pressure. I love everything that Rosa and Ngakia said, and this time has gone by really quickly. I'll say you can follow National Priorities Project's work at either www.ips-dc.org or nationalpriorities.org and sign up for an email list. More so, I want to just kind of ask everybody out there that if whatever group you're involved with currently, community group or campus group or wherever, however you came to us tonight, look around and reach out to other, if you're in the immigrant rights community, look around, and if you're not already connected to somebody nearby who's in the, policing justice community, reach out. If you're not already connected to somebody in the peace community, reach out, or whichever kind of place you're situated, look around, and whoever's nearby that you may not already be connected to, get connected. Because we need more power for all of these things. We need more people. And we got to start building those connections. So that's my major ask.
What a fantastic note to end on, because yeah, these things really are connected in the, when we don't see that is much to our detriment, but when we do see it, it's extremely important. And I also, I really appreciate and want to reiterate what Rosa said about the impacted communities have the solutions to these problems. And one way or another, we are impacted and entangled in these problems. And so how do we reach across these silos and actually work together collectively to find the solutions? I think that's what we're all committed to in ongoing ways. So thank you all so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure and an honor, and everybody stay safe and, get vaccinated and demilitarize. Take care, everybody.